When an empire builds itself on loyalty, betrayal becomes the ultimate sin. In ancient Rome, faith to the state, the gods, and the emperor was not just expected, it was sacred. To betray Rome was to betray civilization itself. The city that called itself the Eternal City demanded an eternal kind of devotion, and those who broke that covenant faced punishments that went far beyond death. Crucifixion may have been Rome's most infamous execution, but for traitors, the empire reserved something far darker: the erasure of existence, the unmaking of a soul. The story begins in the heart of the empire, marble streets glowing under torchlight, the air heavy with incense and suspicion. Senators whisper in corridors lined with statues of gods, each one watching silently as secrets are traded for survival. A general returns from campaign, greeted not with triumph, but with silence, as rumors of treason spread like plague through the forum. In this world, a single word, perditio, betrayal, could destroy everything. It was more than a legal charge. It was a spiritual stain that no blood could wash away. Rome demanded loyalty not only in life, but in memory, and the cost of disloyalty was to be forgotten entirely. The Romans understood betrayal as chaos, a rupture in the natural order. They saw their empire as the embodiment of divine harmony, and every act of treason threatened that fragile balance. When a soldier deserted, when a senator conspired, when a friend turned on the emperor, Rome did not merely punish, it purified. Pain was not the goal, it was the instrument of restoration. To betray the emperor was to betray the gods who sanctioned his rule. To betray one's oath was to tear at the cosmic fabric that held the world together. That belief made Roman justice both terrifying and absolute. Imagine standing in the center of the forum as a condemned traitor is paraded through the crowd. Chains clatter around his wrists. His family follows behind, veiled and silent. The mob chants not for mercy but for cleansing, because betrayal, to the Roman mind, infected everything it touched. The traitor's punishment had to do more than end a life. It had to erase a legacy. The people demanded a spectacle that reminded them of what loyalty truly cost. In this ritual of public vengeance, cruelty became ceremony, and pain became proof of faith. But beneath the cruelty, there was fear, the fear of uncertainty, the fear that loyalty could never be trusted. Even emperors were haunted by the ghosts of betrayal. Julius Caesar fell beneath the knives of men he called friends. Caligula, paranoid and unstable, executed his own guards for imagined plots. Sejanus, once the most powerful man in Rome, was torn apart by the same crowd that once bowed before him. The empire was built on loyalty, yet loyalty was always a blade pointed inward. Every act of devotion contained the seed of betrayal, and every punishment was an attempt to control it. The Romans believed that memory was immortality. To be remembered was to live forever in the eyes of the gods and the people. That is why crucifixion, though brutal, was not the worst fate they could conceive. The real horror was to be forgotten, to have one's name, image, and story erased from existence. This was the punishment reserved for traitors, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. In their view, it was worse than death, for it denied the victim even the shadow of legacy. It turned a life into dust, and a name into silence. As the torches flicker across the marble faces of forgotten emperors and condemned senators, we begin to understand that in Rome, the body could die, but the true death came after. It was the death of identity, the erasure of self from history. Betrayal was not simply punished, it was undone. The city that conquered the world also mastered the art of annihilation, not just of flesh, but of meaning. And for those who broke faith with Rome, crucifixion was mercy compared to what awaited them. This is the story of what the Romans did to betrayers, the rituals, the laws, and the psychological horrors that made betrayal a fate worse than any death. It is a story about how loyalty became religion, and how the loss of it became damnation. Through the eyes of the condemned, we will walk the marble corridors of power and terror, through the darkness of punishment and the silence of erasure. Because in the empire that called itself eternal, there was only one unforgivable crime: to betray Rome. In the heart of Rome, loyalty was more than a virtue, it was the lifeblood of the empire. Every stone of the city, every oath sworn before the gods, pulsed with one sacred principle, fides. To the Romans, fides meant faith, trust, and reliability, not just between friends, but between citizens and the gods, soldiers and commanders, rulers and ruled. It was the invisible thread that bound the vast empire together. To break it was to tear the world itself apart. This wasn't just a political betrayal, it was cosmic treason. The Romans believed that the order of the universe depended on keeping promises, honoring duty, and maintaining absolute devotion to Rome and its divine will. From birth, Romans were trained to worship loyalty as if it were a deity. Fathers taught sons that to serve Rome faithfully was to serve the gods themselves. The word of an oath held the same weight as blood. When a soldier placed his hand upon the altar and swore loyalty to the emperor, it was not mere ceremony, it was a sacred transaction between mortal and divine. Breaking that oath meant breaking faith with Jupiter, the king of the gods, who watched over the sanctity of promises. Betrayal was not just rebellion against the emperor, it was rebellion against heaven. In the Roman military, loyalty was law. Before battle, entire legions gathered under the open sky to renew their oaths of allegiance. The air trembled with the sound of thousands of voices declaring, "Per Iavum e Imperatorum," by Jupiter and the emperor. The punishment for desertion or treason was immediate and absolute. Sometimes, if a unit showed cowardice or disobedience, 1 in every 10 soldiers would be chosen by lot to be executed, a ritual known as decimation. Their comrades were forced to kill them, beating them to death with clubs or stones. This was not just vengeance, it was purification. By destroying the faithless, the Romans believed they restored balance and discipline to the ranks. To serve Rome meant surrendering body and soul to her cause. This sacred loyalty extended far beyond the battlefield. In politics, senators and magistrates were bound by fides publica, the public trust. Their duty was not to personal ambition but to the residential publica, the Roman state itself. Yet as the empire expanded and power concentrated in the hands of emperors, loyalty shifted from the republic to the ruler. To defy the emperor became indistinguishable from betraying Rome. Under emperors like Augustus and Tiberius, the concept of treason, maiestas, evolved into a terrifying weapon. Even a careless word spoken in jest, a doubtful glance, or a private conversation could be twisted into evidence of betrayal. Citizens began to live in quiet fear that their loyalty might be questioned, that a whisper could end their lives. The religious foundations of loyalty made it all the more unbreakable. Temples were not only places of worship but of political allegiance. Every public ritual was also a statement of devotion to the emperor's authority. The imperial cult, the worship of the living emperor as divine, fused politics and religion so completely that one could not exist without the other. To refuse to sacrifice to the emperor's image was a declaration of treason. Those who resisted, early Christians, Jews, or philosophers who clung to older ideals, were seen as enemies of the gods themselves. Their refusal was interpreted as betrayal, not of politics, but of the sacred Roman order. To the Roman mind, loyalty was more than obedience. It was identity. To be Roman was to belong to something greater than oneself, an eternal civilization chosen by the gods. Every oath, every law, every monument reinforced this divine connection. Even slaves were expected to mirror this loyalty to their masters, for hierarchy itself was sacred. Betrayal at any level, from servant to senator, threatened to unravel the cosmic hierarchy that Rome believed was ordained by the heavens. Thus, loyalty was worship, and betrayal was blasphemy. This obsession with loyalty created a society constantly balancing between faith and fear. Emperors demanded devotion, yet lived haunted by paranoia. The Senate proclaimed allegiance but whispered conspiracies in shadowed halls. Soldiers pledged their lives to generals who could be declared traitors overnight. It was a world where loyalty was sacred but fragile. One accusation could turn a loyal servant into a condemned traitor. The system itself fed on suspicion, ensuring that every act of devotion carried the echo of potential betrayal. And yet, beneath the cruelty of this ideology, there was a strange beauty. The Roman sense of loyalty carried with it a profound sense of purpose. the belief that to live faithfully was to be part of something eternal. To betray Rome was not merely to die, but to fall from grace, to sever the link between man and divinity. The empire's strength came from this shared conviction that Rome was more than a place. It was destiny itself. The gods favored her because her people remained loyal. That was the myth that built an empire, and the delusion that justified its punishments. As centuries passed, loyalty in Rome evolved into a weapon, wielded by emperors to control the hearts and minds of their subjects. Every oath became a test. Every act of obedience was an act of survival. The Romans no longer served because they believed because they feared. In this sacred empire of loyalty, love for Rome and terror of Rome became indistinguishable. And when betrayal finally came, the punishment was designed to make the entire world remember, and the betrayer disappear. In the empire of loyalty, devotion was divine, and treachery was cosmic heresy. The Romans saw themselves as custodians of order, chosen by fate to preserve civilization against the chaos of betrayal. That belief made their justice merciless, their punishments sacred, and their empire eternal. Yet beneath the marble and ritual, one truth pulsed quietly through every Roman heart. Loyalty was the only path to immortality, and betrayal was the road to oblivion. Betrayal in Rome was not a single act. It was a chain reaction that spread like poison through the veins of an empire obsessed with loyalty. It began in whispers, in the flicker of an unguarded glance, a secret letter, a shared drink between supposed friends. One word, proditio, could turn an ally into an enemy, a senator into a corpse, a hero into a ghost. Rome was built on the illusion of unity, but behind the marble facades and gilded temples, fear and ambition danced in the shadows. Betrayal was both inevitable and unforgivable, and every generation produced its share of traitors who would pay for their ambition with everything they held dear. The Romans believed betrayal did not come from strangers. It came from those closest to you, from the ones who knew your secrets, who had shared your victories and sworn your oaths. To the Roman mind, this made the act all the more vile. A traitor was not simply a rebel, he was a corrupter of trust, a defiler of sacred bonds. To betray the emperor, the army, or the Senate was to infect Rome itself with disease. The betrayal of one man could doom thousands. It was not only a political crime, it was contagion. The empire's obsession with control demanded that such contamination be cleansed, violently and publicly. History records countless acts of treason that shattered Rome's fragile peace. One of the earliest and most infamous came during the Catalan conspiracy of 63 BCE. Lucius Sergius Catilina, a patrician senator burning with resentment, plotted to overthrow the republic itself. Disguised as a crusade for justice, his scheme was a plan to seize power through chaos. Cicero, then consul, uncovered the plot and exposed the conspirators before the Senate. In his thunderous orations, Cicero branded Catiline and his followers as enemies of the state, traitors unworthy of burial. When Catiline fled Rome, he was hunted and killed in battle, his head brought back as proof of Rome's vengeance. The Senate declared him an enemy of the Republic, his name cursed, his legacy erased. His betrayal became a warning carved into history. Rome would not forgive those who sought to destroy her from within. But the pattern of betrayal did not end with the Republic. When the empire was born under Augustus, betrayal became an art form wrapped in silk and ceremony. Power bred paranoia. Emperors trusted no one, not their advisors, not their wives, not even their children. Under Tiberius, the crime of maestas, or treason, expanded to terrifying extremes. Citizens accused each other to prove loyalty, and entire families were destroyed by suspicion. The philosopher Cremutius Cordus was condemned for praising Brutus and Cassius, the men who had killed Julius Caesar decades earlier. His writings were burned, and he chose suicide over humiliation. His crime? Admiring men whom Rome had once called liberators, but now labeled traitors. The line between loyalty and betrayal blurred until no one could tell where it lay. In the year of the four emperors, 69 CE, betrayal reached its most chaotic and blood-soaked form. Within a single year, 4 men claimed the throne: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. Each rise was built on treachery, and each fall soaked the streets of Rome in blood. Generals betrayed their emperors, soldiers betrayed their generals, and the empire teetered on collapse. Otho, once Galba's ally, ordered his former friend's execution. Vitellius's men murdered Otho's supporters in revenge. It was a chain of betrayal feeding on itself, an empire devouring its own heart. By the time Vespasian restored order, Rome had learned a grim lesson. Betrayal was not only punished, it was contagious. It infected even those who punished it. Among soldiers, betrayal took many forms: desertion, mutiny, conspiracy. The army, Rome's most disciplined creation, was also its most dangerous when trust broke down. A commander's life depended on the loyalty of his legions. One whisper of treason could turn an entire army into a mob. During the reign of Nero, the commander Gaius Julius Vindex rose in rebellion, calling for Nero's overthrow. His troops turned against him before the battle was even fought. Vindex died by his own hand, and his name was cursed. Yet his rebellion inspired others, and before long, Nero himself was declared a public enemy by the Senate. The empire had turned on itself. Betrayal begot betrayal, and Rome's punishment was to choke on the very loyalty it demanded. But betrayal was not always born of ambition. Sometimes it came from desperation, from the slow corrosion of trust. Slaves turned against masters, wives informed on husbands, friends denounced friends. The system rewarded betrayal of others even as it condemned betrayal of Rome. Informers, delators, became a new breed of traitors sanctioned by the state. They thrived under emperors like Tiberius and Domitian, growing rich from the confiscated estates of the condemned. Rome had created a society where everyone lived in fear of everyone else, where loyalty itself became a performance. The empire's strength had become its weakness. In demanding total obedience, it created a world where no one truly trusted anyone. In this atmosphere of paranoia, betrayal was both crime and mirror. It reflected the empire's own corruption. To the Romans, it was proof that even divine order could rot from within. The betrayer was a symbol of what every Roman feared most: the collapse of trust, the unraveling of identity. Because if Rome could not trust her own sons, then perhaps she was not eternal after all. This thought terrified them more than any barbarian invasion or civil war. When the Romans punished traitors, they were not merely enacting justice. They were trying to purge a sickness. To them, betrayal was a moral infection that had to be cut out from the body of the state. Death alone was not enough. The traitor's name had to be blotted from every record, their statues destroyed, their families dishonored. It was not simply about punishment, it was about restoring cosmic order. Rome's cruelty was not random, it was ritual. Every execution, every erasure, every act of public humiliation served to remind the people that Rome itself was sacred, and that its faith must never be broken. As the sun set over the blood-stained stones of the Forum, the empire stood vigilant, trembling beneath its own perfection. Every act of treachery left scars not only on bodies, but on memory. The Romans understood something terrifying about betrayal, that it could never truly be destroyed, only forgotten. And so they learned to strike not just at the flesh of the betrayer, but at his ghost, his name, his story. Because in Rome, the punishment for treason did not end with death. It began with it. To the Romans, crucifixion was not the ultimate horror. It was a punishment for thieves, rebels, and slaves, a spectacle meant to humiliate, to mark the body as a lesson in pain. But for the betrayer, death by the cross was too merciful. The empire reserved something far worse, something that lingered beyond death. To betray Rome was to lose the very essence of existence: one's name, one's memory, one's place in the eternal story of civilization. This was damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, and in the Roman mind, it was a punishment far greater than any torment of the flesh. For a people who believed immortality was achieved through legacy, to be erased from history was the most complete form of annihilation. The Romans believed that a man lived on through remembrance, through his deeds, his titles, his monuments, and his descendants. A good Roman sought Gloria, the eternal echo of his name carried through time. Generals built temples to commemorate victories, senators erected statues to their own virtue, and poets immortalized heroes in verse. Every Roman dreamed of being remembered. And so, when the state decreed damnatio memoriae, it struck at the soul itself. It was not enough to kill the traitor. The empire had to destroy the idea of him, his image, his lineage, his very existence, as if he had never lived. The process began with ritual precision. Once a man was condemned, the Senate or the emperor would issue a decree. His name would be stricken from official records. His face would be chiseled out of marble reliefs, his inscriptions scraped clean from monuments and tombs. Portraits were burned, statues toppled, coins defaced. If he had written books or letters, they were ordered destroyed. Even his family might be forbidden to speak his name. In a society where memory was sacred, silence was the greatest curse. The condemned was exiled not just from Rome, but from time itself. One of the most haunting examples was the fate of Publius Septimius Geta, brother of Emperor Caracalla. After years of rivalry, Caracalla murdered Geta in their mother's arms, staining her dress with her son's blood. But death was not enough. Caracalla decreed damnatio memoriae upon his brother's name. Sculptors were ordered to remove Geta's face from every fresco and statue in the empire. Coins bearing his likeness were melted down. In surviving reliefs, one can still see the eerie outlines of his erased image, a ghostly void where a man once stood. To the Romans, that absence was worse than a corpse. It was an eternal wound in history, proof that memory itself could be mutilated. Another victim of this ultimate punishment was Sejanus, the powerful prefect of the Praetorian Guard under Emperor Tiberius. 4 years, Sejanus was the second most powerful man in Rome, a figure both feared and worshipped. But ambition turned to treachery. When Tiberius learned of Sejanus's conspiracy, the emperor struck with divine fury. Sejanus was executed, his body torn apart by the mob, but the real punishment came after. His statues were smashed, his inscriptions obliterated. Even those who had once spoken his name with reverence now spat upon it. His family was slaughtered, his children strangled. Rome did not merely kill the man. It buried the memory of his existence beneath a mountain of silence. The mechanics of erasure were deliberate, almost sacred. It was a purification ritual disguised as punishment. The Romans saw memory as part of the moral universe. To remember evil was to risk reviving it. By erasing the traitor's name, they believed they were restoring harmony to the world. The marble dust of defaced statues was more than debris. It was symbolic ash, the residue of moral cleansing. But beneath this theology of purification lay fear, the fear that remembrance could keep rebellion alive, that memory itself could challenge imperial authority. In this ritual destruction, art became an instrument of vengeance. The same artisans who once immortalized heroes in stone were now forced to erase them. One sculptor, chiseling away the face of a disgraced emperor, once carved a faint shadow of the eyes, a secret act of defiance, leaving behind the ghost of what once was. For every name erased, there was always a trace that refused to die. The Romans sought to silence the past, but memory has a way of surviving even in absence. The void left behind spoke louder than the marble that surrounded it. To the common people, damnatio memoriae carried a strange, terrifying poetry. It was as though the gods themselves had withdrawn favor. The condemned were not merely dead, they were spiritually undone. Their ghosts were denied entrance to the underworld because no one would speak their names. Romans often placed the names of their dead on tombstones so that the living could call them forth during rites. But those who suffered memory's condemnation were left nameless, wandering eternally between worlds. Death, in Roman thought, required remembrance. Without it, even the afterlife rejected you. The horror of damnatio memoriae lay not in what it did, but in what it prevented: remembrance, mourning, legacy. Families were forbidden to hold funerals or to display the ancestral masks, imagines, of the condemned. It was as if the bloodline itself had been severed from history. A son could not inherit his father's honors. A wife could not speak of her husband's life. The silence was suffocating, and it stretched across generations. Rome's justice did not simply punish, it rewrote reality. And yet, even in their erasure, the condemned left a mark. The chiseled faces, the blank spaces where names once stood, became silent monuments to Rome's obsession with control. Walk through the ruins of the empire today, and you can still see them. Inscriptions ending abruptly, faceless figures carved into friezes, the stone itself whispering the truth the empire tried to bury. The Romans believed they were destroying traitors. In truth, they immortalized their absence. To be crucified was to suffer for a day. To be condemned to damnatio memoriae was to suffer forever. It was the punishment of oblivion, the erasure of the soul from history. No cries, no flames, no torment could compare to the eternal silence of being forgotten. In the empire that worshipped remembrance, this was the ultimate execution, not of flesh, but of meaning. And in the shadow of this fate, even the cross seemed merciful. There are few stories in Roman history as chilling, as vividly human, as the fall of Lucius Aelius Sejanus. To understand what Rome did to her betrayers, one must understand what was done to him, a man who rose higher than any non-emperor in Roman history, and who fell harder than any before him. His name, once whispered with awe, became a curse. His face, once carved into marble, was hacked from stone. And his death, though brutal, was only the beginning of his punishment. Sejanus was not merely executed, he was unmade. His story is a perfect reflection of Rome's most terrifying truth, that loyalty was never safe and betrayal was never forgotten. Sejanus began as a soldier, ambitious, intelligent, and utterly loyal to Emperor Tiberius. He commanded the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal army and the most powerful force in the empire. But Sejanus was no mere soldier, he was a master manipulator. Through charm, cunning, and calculated obedience, he became Tiberius's most trusted man, the guardian of the emperor's safety, the gatekeeper of his secrets, and eventually, the shadow behind his throne. Rome bowed before him. Senators courted his favor. Statues of Sejanus were raised across the empire, and his name was praised as if he were a god in waiting. But loyalty in Rome was a performance, and Sejanus was the empire's greatest actor. Behind his public devotion, he was building a silent empire of his own, forging alliances, eliminating rivals, and even dreaming, some said, of replacing Tiberius himself. He used his position to destroy others, whispering poison into the emperor's ear, turning suspicion into death sentences. Those who opposed him vanished. Their estates were seized, their names erased. For nearly a decade, Sejanus ruled Rome in everything but name. And then, like all things in Rome, his fortune turned. Tiberius, withdrawn and paranoid, had retreated to the island of Capri. From there, he ruled through letters and informers, half god, half ghost. As Sejanus's power grew, so did the emperor's unease. Rumors reached him, whispers of treason, of ambitions that stretched beyond loyalty. It was said that Sejanus sought to marry into the imperial family, to place himself next in line for the throne. The emperor's silence turned heavy, and in that silence, the machinery of vengeance began to turn. In October of the year 31 CE, Tiberius struck. A message from the emperor was read aloud in the Senate, seemingly in Sejanus's favor. The senators leaned forward, expecting a new honor to be announced. Instead, the letter turned cold. The words shifted from praise to accusation. Treason. Betrayal. Conspiracy against the emperor. Sejanus, standing among the senators, went pale. In a single breath, his world collapsed. The guards he once commanded seized him. The Senate, terrified of Tiberius's wrath, condemned him to death without trial. Sejanus was dragged through the streets of Rome, stripped of rank, stripped of dignity, and bound in chains. The same crowd that had once bowed before him now screamed for his blood. The Roman mob, always hungry for vengeance, tore at his clothes, spat in his face, hurled filth and stones. He was executed that night, strangled, according to some accounts, beaten to death according to others. His corpse was thrown onto the Gemonian steps, the city's infamous stairway of shame, where criminals' bodies were left to rot. For 3 days, his body lay there, mutilated by the crowd. Children threw stones at it. Dogs gnawed his limbs. The people who had once worshipped him now took turns desecrating what was left. But Sejanus's death was not enough. Rome demanded purification. The emperor ordered damnatio memoriae upon his name. Every statue of him was toppled, every inscription erased. His home was torn apart, his possessions confiscated, his portraits destroyed. And then came the final horror, his family. His sons were executed, their bodies displayed before the people. His daughter, too young to be legally killed, was first raped, because Roman law forbade the execution of virgins, and then strangled. Tiberius's decree made it clear, betrayal was a plague, and it must be rooted out down to the last drop of blood. The Romans did not believe in partial justice. They believed in purification through total annihilation. What makes Sejanus's fall so haunting is not merely the violence of his death, but the speed of Rome's transformation. In a single night, the empire's most powerful man became its most hated enemy. Friends vanished. Allies turned informers. Senators who had once praised him now spat on his name to prove their loyalty to Tiberius. Rome devoured him with the same hunger it had once used to elevate him. The public mutilation of Sejanus's corpse was not random cruelty, it was a performance of purification, a collective ritual of forgetting. By desecrating the body, Rome symbolically purged itself of the corruption his betrayal had unleashed. Psychologically, the story of Sejanus reveals the dark symmetry of Roman loyalty. The empire demanded total devotion, but that devotion could turn into accusation overnight. Every Roman knew that to rise too high was to invite suspicion, and suspicion was death. Sejanus had mastered the politics of fear, until he became its final victim. His punishment was meant not only to destroy him but to remind the people that loyalty was conditional, fragile, and ultimately owned by the emperor alone. The spectacle of his death was also meant to cleanse the collective conscience. The mob's participation turned vengeance into virtue. By tearing apart the betrayer, the people reaffirmed their own innocence, their own loyalty. In Rome, cruelty was not barbarism, it was a moral act. Pain was proof of faith. The execution of Sejanus was not simply the fall of one man, it was a purification of the empire itself. And yet, there is a bitter irony that lingers over Sejanus's story. In erasing him, Rome immortalized him. The empty spaces on statues, the missing inscriptions, the silences in official histories, all testify to the violence of his erasure. He became a ghost haunting the very memory that sought to destroy him. In trying to obliterate his name, Rome gave it a darker kind of immortality. For centuries after his death, his story remained a warning. The higher you rise in Rome, the closer you come to the blade. Sejanus's fate reveals the core of Rome's psychological cruelty. The Romans believed justice was not simply about punishment, it was about restoring divine order. A betrayer disrupted that order, and so his destruction had to be absolute, physical, moral, spiritual. His death was a sacrifice offered to the gods of loyalty, a ritual meant to appease the cosmic balance. Every execution was both justice and religion. In the end, Sejanus's downfall was not unique, it was inevitable. Rome produced him, then destroyed him, as it would destroy many who came after. In a world where power was worshipped and loyalty was currency, betrayal was always just one whisper away. His story is not only about treachery but about the terror of living under an empire that could turn love into death and devotion into damnation. The execution of Sejanus stands as the most haunting example of how Rome punished betrayal. The brutality of his fall, the desecration of his body, the murder of his family, and the erasure of his name were not excesses of cruelty, they were the purest expression of Roman justice. To betray Rome was to offend the gods, and only total annihilation could cleanse the world of that sin. Sejanus was the empire's mirror, a reflection of its paranoia, its pride, and its hunger for absolute control. And when Rome shattered that mirror, it saw itself for what it truly was, a civilization that could not live without loyalty and could not survive without blood. When the Romans punished a betrayer, they did not simply aim to kill the body, they aimed to destroy the soul. Nowhere was this more horrifyingly evident than in their use of poena cullei, the punishment reserved for the most despised of all traitors, those who betrayed their own blood. It was a ritual so grotesque, so drenched in symbolism, that even Roman historians struggled to describe it without a shudder. This was not crucifixion. This was something older, darker, and far more ritualistic. A punishment meant to unmake a human being, to erase their very identity from the world of the living. The word culleus means leather sack, and it was into such a sack that the condemned would be sewn alive. But before that, Rome demanded a spectacle, a ritual preparation designed to strip the betrayer of all humanity. The condemned was first beaten with rods, a reminder that he was no longer a citizen but a beast. His head was covered with a wolf's hide or sometimes a burlap hood, to cut him off from the light of reason, to blind him from the world he had defied. His shoes were replaced with wooden clogs, ensuring that his feet, like his conscience, would feel nothing but the weight of his guilt. Every gesture was a symbol, every blow was a sermon in pain. Then came the true horror. Before being sealed in the sack, the betrayer was placed alongside 4 living creatures: a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a serpent. To modern eyes, the combination seems arbitrary, even absurd. But to the Romans, every animal represented a fragment of the traitor's soul, a reflection of his corruption. The dog, once the symbol of loyalty, became the perverted reminder of what he had betrayed. The rooster, herald of dawn, mocked him with the light he would never see again. The monkey, a parody of humanity, reflected his moral degradation, a mirror of what he had become. And the serpent, the eternal symbol of deceit, was his final companion, the living embodiment of his crime. When the sack was sewn shut, the betrayer was trapped in a living nightmare. The animals thrashed, bit, clawed, and shrieked in panic, their terror mirroring his own. Inside that writhing prison, there was no language, no law, no light, only chaos. Man and beast fused into a single trembling mass, a microcosm of disorder. The Romans believed that betrayal itself was a violation of cosmic harmony, a rebellion against the natural order, and so the punishment had to reflect that same disintegration. The sack was not just a container, it was a tomb of moral dissolution. Once sealed, the culleus was dragged through the streets, displayed before the people as an object of awe and disgust. The crowd jeered and shouted curses, not merely at the man but at the idea of betrayal itself. The spectacle served as a collective exorcism, Rome's way of cleansing its conscience through violence. Then the sack was carried to the Tiber River or sometimes to the sea, and thrown into the water. The condemned would drown in total darkness, unable to see the world he had betrayed, his final breath swallowed by the same element that symbolized purification in Roman ritual. Water held a special meaning in this punishment. It was both womb and grave, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. By casting the betrayer into the river, the Romans were not merely killing him, they were erasing him from the human realm altogether. No burial, no tomb, no memory. His body could never be recovered, his name never honored. He became a ghost without a place, condemned to wander forever. To the Roman mind, this was the ultimate horror, to be forgotten by both gods and men. But beneath the cruelty lies something deeper, a symbolic language of justice that reveals the Roman psyche. Poena cullei was not simply vengeance, it was purification. The sack, the animals, the water, all formed a ritual of cosmic restoration. The Romans saw betrayal as a kind of infection, a disease that spread decay through family, city, and empire. The traitor had violated the sacred bond of trust that held the world together. Thus, his punishment had to reflect the unraveling of that order. By sealing him in a chaotic prison with beasts, they symbolically returned him to the primal state from which civilization had risen. The river then reclaimed him, washing the stain away so that Rome could remain pure. This blending of brutality and ritual defined the Roman approach to justice. They did not see cruelty as barbaric, they saw it as meaningful. Pain was not simply inflicted, it was choreographed. Every lash, every scream, every movement of the ritual carried moral weight. The Romans believed that only through suffering could order be restored, and that to forgive a betrayer was to invite divine wrath. Their punishments were sermons in blood, public lessons meant to remind citizens that loyalty was sacred and disobedience unholy. The psychological power of poena cullei cannot be overstated. It attacked not only the body but the mind and the imagination. To know that one would die sealed in darkness, surrounded by hissing and howling creatures, denied even the peace of death rites, it was a terror that lingered in the Roman subconscious for generations. Parents told their children the story to warn them of disobedience. Philosophers used it to discuss moral decay. The image of the writhing sack became a metaphor for disorder, for what happens when Rome's laws are broken and chaos takes hold. Even emperors who stood above the law feared this kind of symbolic destruction. Betrayal, after all, was not limited to the lowborn. Senators, generals, and even family members could find themselves accused of treason. The culleus was reserved for parricides, those who killed their own kin, but the idea behind it, the total unmaking of the betrayer, hovered over every act of political disloyalty. Rome's rulers used that fear as a weapon, ensuring that loyalty was not born of love, but of terror. From a modern perspective, the punishment reveals something both monstrous and brilliant about the Roman mind. They understood, perhaps better than any civilization before or since, that power is maintained not merely through law, but through fear, through spectacle, through myth, through the manipulation of the collective imagination. The poena cullei was not meant to reform the guilty, it was meant to warn the innocent. It was the empire's way of saying that to betray one's bond, to tear apart the sacred web of loyalty, was to become something less than human. And yet, within the cruelty lies a paradox. The very civilization that built aqueducts, roads, and laws also invented punishments that defied comprehension. They sought order but achieved it through horror. They worshipped reason but used madness as a tool of control. The sack, the beasts, the drowning, all of it reveals a people both civilized and savage, logical yet deeply superstitious. Rome's greatness and its darkness were inseparable. The same culture that wrote philosophies of virtue also invented the most symbolic tortures known to history. In the end, poena cullei stands as one of the most haunting testaments to Roman justice, not because of its brutality alone, but because of its meaning. It was not chaos for chaos's sake, it was structured cruelty, a ritual designed to uphold an empire's moral architecture. To betray was to invite cosmic collapse, and the sack was the answer, a prison of flesh and terror, floating on the current of divine vengeance. As the sack sank beneath the waters of the Tiber, the crowd would fall silent. The river would close, smooth and indifferent, erasing the last trace of the condemned. And in that stillness, Rome would feel cleansed, its order restored, its gods appeased, its people reminded that betrayal was not just a crime against man, but an offense against the very fabric of the universe. In the vast and merciless theater of Roman justice, cruelty was never random, it was divine. To the Romans, pain was not merely the tool of punishment, it was a language. Through it, the gods spoke, and through it, men were purified. The betrayer was not only a criminal, he was a moral infection, an offense against the sacred order of the cosmos. To harm him was not an act of vengeance but an offering, a sacrifice to the gods who demanded equilibrium between loyalty and treachery, honor and disgrace. Rome's gods were not merciful. They were hungry for justice, and that justice often wore the face of suffering. This belief was not born in cruelty but in religion. In the Roman world, faith was not a private matter of the soul, it was a public covenant between the people and their gods, a system of reciprocal obligation known as pietas. The state existed because the gods allowed it. Victory in war, the fertility of the soil, even the stability of the seasons depended on Rome's faithfulness to divine law. Betrayal, therefore, was more than treason against men. It was a fracture in the bond between the mortal and the divine. The punishment of betrayers, then, was a kind of sacrifice, a ritual to restore balance between heaven and earth. Every Roman punishment carried a symbolic echo of this theology. The crucifixion, for instance, was not invented by Rome but perfected by it, a death so slow and humiliating that it erased individuality itself. It was often used not just against rebels and slaves but against those who defied divine or imperial authority. The cross was both a tool and a warning, a public altar where the empire offered human agony to appease divine order. The same logic underpinned the damnatio memoriae, the legal erasure of a traitor's name. To remove a man's memory was to cleanse his spiritual corruption from the universe. The gods would not be appeased until the betrayer's existence had been conceptually obliterated. To understand how deep this belief ran, one must remember that Rome did not distinguish between religion and politics. The emperor himself was a bridge, Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the Roman world. Betrayal against him was not political disobedience, it was blasphemy. To betray the emperor was to defy the gods who had chosen him. That is why traitors' executions were often staged near temples, forums, or sacred groves, places where the divine could bear witness. Even the methods of execution carried ritual meaning. The scourging before crucifixion symbolized purification. The act of stripping the condemned naked reflected their moral exposure before the gods. Death was not simply inflicted, it was orchestrated as a performance of cosmic order being restored. The Romans believed that the gods themselves had suffered and sacrificed to preserve the world's balance. In this way, divine pain legitimized human punishment. Take the story of Prometheus, adopted into Roman philosophy. The titan who stole fire from the gods was bound, his liver eaten daily by an eagle, a mythic embodiment of endless, divine retribution. Or consider the Roman interpretation of Hercules, who endured labors of suffering as penance for his sins. Pain, in these myths, was both punishment and purification. Rome mirrored these divine patterns in its laws. The empire's punishments were not merely repressive, they were mythic reenactments of celestial justice. And so, when a betrayer was condemned, whether nailed to wood, burned alive, sewn in a sack, or torn apart by beasts, the Romans saw not a man dying, but order being reborn. The gods demanded visible proof that Rome remained faithful to their cosmic law. The execution was the bridge between sin and restoration, chaos and harmony. In their worldview, mercy was dangerous because it invited imbalance. If a traitor were allowed to live, his sin might spread like contagion, and the gods, in their rage, might punish not only the guilty but the entire city. Thus, cruelty became virtue, and compassion became risk. What made this theology so powerful, and so terrifying, was its fusion with Roman psychology. The average Roman citizen lived in a world where fear of divine wrath and fear of imperial punishment were indistinguishable. Every act of obedience was both civic duty and spiritual devotion. The execution of a betrayer was therefore a collective reaffirmation of faith. The people watched not only to witness justice, but to participate in it. Their horror was mixed with reverence, their disgust with a dark kind of awe. The sight of a man being destroyed was not purely entertainment, it was reassurance that the world was still in balance, that the gods were still watching, and that Rome was still favored. There was also an element of projection in this sacred cruelty. The Romans were acutely aware of their own potential for betrayal, of how fragile loyalty could be when tested by ambition, greed, or fear. By watching a traitor's agony, they symbolically expelled their own guilt. Each lash of the whip, each scream, each drop of blood was a ritual of catharsis. They were not merely punishing one man, they were purging the shadow that lurked within themselves. In the betrayer's suffering, they saw both their own weakness and their deliverance from it. Philosophers of the time even tried to rationalize this moral theater. Seneca, writing under Nero, argued that punishment was necessary not to destroy but to teach. Yet in the same breath, he described executions so severe that their deaths instruct the living. The lesson was clear: pain was a form of moral education. The gods taught through agony. The empire maintained order not by reason, but by ritualized horror. The emperor himself was both priest and executioner. When he ordered the death of a traitor, he was not acting out of personal rage but divine duty, or so the narrative went. In this way, the emperor's violence became sanctified. His cruelty was not tyranny, it was devotion. Emperors like Tiberius, Domitian, and Caracalla justified their purges by claiming divine sanction. To question their vengeance was to question the gods themselves. This sacred authority allowed them to wield unimaginable power without moral restraint. And so, divine justice became indistinguishable from human vengeance. But even within this terrifying logic, there were cracks. Some Romans, philosophers, poets, and moralists began to see the cost of this theology of pain. They saw that the empire's obsession with purification had turned it into a machine of fear. To them, the gods no longer seemed divine but monstrous reflections of human cruelty. The punishment of betrayers had become so excessive, so ritualized, that it began to consume the very virtue it sought to protect. Rome's moral order, once grounded in pietas, had become an idol built from terror. And yet, the system endured. The people continued to gather in the amphitheater, their hearts caught between piety and pleasure. They watched animals tear men apart, saw flames devour flesh, and believed that the gods were being served. Pain had become a sacrament. Suffering had become faith. The execution ground was the new altar of Rome, and each death was a prayer. In this grim convergence of religion and punishment lies the key to Rome's endurance and its tragedy. The empire lasted for centuries not because it was merciful, but because it convinced its citizens that cruelty was sacred. The gods of Rome were gods of order, not compassion. Their justice was iron, not mercy. And in serving them, Rome became both the most disciplined and the most destructive civilization in history. When a betrayer screamed beneath the lash or drowned in darkness, the people did not avert their eyes, they prayed. They saw in his agony the reflection of divine law, a reminder that the universe demanded loyalty and that disobedience would always summon the same fate. The gods of pain ruled not only the heavens, but the human heart. And under their gaze, Rome flourished, proud, brutal, and ever faithful to its terrible gods. In the dying years of the empire, cruelty became law, and fear its final emperor. Rome had once punished to preserve order, but now it punished to feel alive. The spectacle of pain had become the empire's only heartbeat. Senators accused each other before the same crowds that once cheered their triumphs. The prisons overflowed, and every execution became a desperate attempt to prove that Rome still ruled something, even if only death itself. The people no longer watched in horror but in hunger, their faith in justice replaced by fascination. Betrayers were flayed, burned, or erased from memory, but the true rot lay unseen, in the hearts of those who applauded. When mercy died, Rome lost its soul, and cruelty became its god. The empire no longer needed enemies, it had devoured itself. When the fires of Rome burned out and the marble crumbled, something far more enduring remained, the idea that order demands suffering. Empires rise and fall, kings die, gods change names, but this idea, born in Roman blood and marble, never left us. The punishments that Rome used on its betrayers were not just acts of vengeance, they were blueprints, lessons written in pain for the civilizations that followed. And long after Rome's legions vanished, its philosophy of fear survived, hidden beneath new flags and faiths. Rome taught the world that loyalty could be bought with terror, that justice could wear the face of cruelty, and that the destruction of one soul could preserve the illusion of peace. Every empire since has borrowed from that logic, whether through gallows and prisons, or through silence and exile. The spectacle may have changed, but the essence remains. We still build our laws upon fear, still measure justice by the pain it inflicts, still believe that betrayal is a wound that can only be healed by blood. The genius of Rome was that it made cruelty feel sacred. It was not savagery, they believed, but ceremony, a sacrifice offered to the gods of order. The Romans saw themselves as surgeons cutting rot from the body of civilization. But in their quest to preserve purity, they poisoned themselves. For every name they erased, a shadow grew larger. For every traitor they destroyed, 100 more learned to hide behind loyalty. The empire's walls were strong, but its conscience hollowed from within. And yet, as history turned, the world could not forget Rome's script. The medieval church, inheriting its bones, found holiness in suffering. Monarchs learned to rule through fear wrapped in divinity. Even modern nations, with their courts and cameras, still echo the same performance. Punishment not just as justice, but as spectacle. The Roman Forum has become the courtroom, the amphitheater replaced by the media, the mob by the audience. We no longer throw stones, we share headlines. But the hunger is the same, to see the condemned suffer, to feel righteousness in their destruction. This is Rome's invisible empire, an empire of the mind. It has no borders, no soldiers, no emperors, yet it rules the world through ideas, loyalty, obedience, retribution. Every government that preaches order over compassion, every institution that values silence over truth, every society that teaches fear before understanding, all of them are heirs to Rome. The eternal city may have fallen, but its shadow stretches across time, dark and familiar. What the Romans did to betrayers was more than execution, it was erasure. They believed that by destroying a person's name, they destroyed their meaning. And that belief, in its own way, has survived. Modern exile takes new forms, reputations ruined, voices silenced, identities stripped away. We do not crucify or sew our traitors into sacks, we erase them through narrative. The method changed, the morality did not. Rome's punishment was meant to cleanse the world of betrayal, but instead, it infected it, with the illusion that righteousness can be built on pain. Yet, there is a haunting beauty in the irony of it all. Rome wanted eternity, and in that wish, it succeeded, not through its gods or its legions, but through the persistence of its darkness. The same fear that silenced senators in the Curia now silences dissent in modern halls of power. The same thirst for vengeance that filled the Colosseum now fills our digital arenas. Civilization has advanced, but the heart that once beat beneath Rome's armor still beats in us. We remain fascinated by punishment, intoxicated by moral cruelty, forever drawn to the edge where justice becomes vengeance. But the ruins of Rome whisper a warning. When cruelty becomes virtue, and fear becomes law, the empire has already begun to die. Rome did not collapse in a single day or battle. It rotted from within, one act of sanctioned violence at a time. Every punishment that claimed to save it instead hollowed it further, until loyalty meant nothing and betrayal meant everything. By the end, no one trusted anyone, not the generals, not the Senate, not even the gods. The empire that once ruled the world became a ghost, consumed by its own need to control it. And perhaps that is why we keep telling its story, not to glorify its power, but to understand our own reflection in it. Because when we study Rome, we are not only looking backward, we are peering inward. Its cruelty is our inheritance, its logic our language. We still divide the world between loyalists and traitors, still justify pain as purification, still believe that erasure is justice. The only difference is that now we call it progress. Imagine standing among the ruins of the Forum at dusk. The air is still. The stones that once heard the screams of the condemned now echo with silence. The wind moves through broken columns like the whisper of ghosts. You can almost hear them, the senators who conspired, the soldiers who deserted, the lovers who betrayed, the emperors who feared their own shadows. They are gone, yet not gone. Their names may have been chiseled away, but their story endures, a testament to the price of power and the frailty of faith. Rome's true punishment was never the cross or the sack. It was memory itself, eternal, unmerciful, and reflective. For in remembering what they did to their betrayers, we are forced to confront what humanity still does to its own. The methods have softened, the reasons have shifted, but the instinct remains, to destroy what threatens our illusion of order, no matter the cost. And so, the empire of shadows lives on, not in stone or fire, but in every law that justifies cruelty, every silence that hides a crime, every story that turns pain into virtue. Rome has become a mirror for civilization itself, magnificent and monstrous, radiant and ruined. Its glory reminds us what humanity can build. Its cruelty reminds us what humanity can become. In the end, the lesson of Rome is not about betrayal or punishment, but about the dangerous intimacy between them. To destroy the betrayer, Rome betrayed itself. To preserve its eternity, it chose a God that demanded blood. And though the city fell, that God, the God of fear, of justice without mercy, still walks among us. So when we ask what the Romans did to betrayers, The answer reaches beyond history. They destroyed them, body, name, and soul, believing that in doing so, they protected the world. But the truth is more haunting. They only proved how easily civilization can mistake cruelty for righteousness. Rome is gone, yet its echo remains, whispering from the ruins, a warning carved in stone and blood. Beware the empire that forgets mercy, for it will one day become its own betrayer.